In this video, I'm going to talk about the fans of Chris Watts. Some of these fans are women who write to him in jail, and even though they know he killed his family and some of them are mothers, they still write to him and want to form some kind of relationship with him. So why is that? Well, Sheila Eisenberg wrote a book called Women Who Love Men Who Kill. And Sheila was a reporter before, and she interviewed lots of women to write this book. And she found that the women came from all sorts of different backgrounds, and some of them were very well educated, some of them weren't, but some of them had really successful careers. They were psychiatrists, lawyers, social workers, prison workers as well. And what she found was that they all had something in common, which is that they'd all been abused, either emotionally, sexually or physically, by their parents or just their fathers, or by their first husbands, or by boyfriends. And so she worked out that they were drawn to these men because that way they could go towards what they're familiar with, which is what we all do. We all repeat patterns that are familiar to us, often that come from early childhood. So they go towards what they're familiar with, and they, but in these situations they're actually safe because the men are in jail, so they can't hurt them. And so this way they can have a relationship with them but stay safe. And so many women do that for that purpose, just to repeat this old pattern. They can't help that they're attracted to these men, and but in this way they're able to actually sort of work through their issues because they can have this relationship but stay safe, which is something they've never experienced before. She also found that the kind of love these women had for these men was extreme, that they'd fallen really deeply in love. And part of the reason for that was because they didn't have to have a real life with them. They didn't have to tell them to pick wet towels up off the floor or anything like that, do the washing up, because these men are in jail, and so they only just saw them for snippets of time. And also because, it was often an exciting adventure that the sort of unknowing of, are they going to get parole or not, what's going to happen. So it was a sort of like fantasy really that these women have. And the men who are behind bars are kind of fulfilling this fantasy for them. She described it as like a romance novel because these people are trying to keep you apart. They're behind bars, there are prison guards everywhere, and somehow that just makes it more of a special sort of relationship that people are trying to pull you apart, and that luckily you get to see each other sometimes. Very often these women will make excuses for the murderer. So they'll say, oh, he didn't mean to do it, the gun went off by mistake. One of them was even a juror on the case that convicted a murderer, and she said, that she'd made a mistake, she should never have agreed that he was guilty. So very often they'll rationalise their behaviour and, look at it as that this man is innocent, or at least that's not really the real them. Some of them accept what happened, accept that they meant to do it, but they still feel that they weren't really being themselves, and it was all just a terrible mistake. She noticed that a lot of murderers have groupies, and that she was really shocked by just how many fans they have. And that's something that Chris Watts has. He has whole Facebook groups devoted to him. And one of the reasons for this is that they're high profile people, and people who want attention can talk about them positively, and they're also going to get, they're going to get that attention that is on the murderer. She found that a lot of these women can't have relationships in real life. They have too many issues to be able to deal with a real relationship. And so relating to someone in prison was their way of having a relationship. She said that if you write to somebody in prison and they write back, then you're automatically going to become famous as soon as you tell people about it or show them the letter. And that's another reason people want to do it. Aside from the women who write to men in jail, there's also fans who are men as well, and not necessarily just gay men. That there's men and women who stand up for Chris Watts, who blame his wife, and this victim blaming is also quite interesting. That there's two reasons that people do this. One of them is that they really want to see the best in people, and it's, you know, I guess, you know, it does, you know, it is really naivety that some of these people really do think that maybe he's innocent. Narcissists will stand up for other narcissists, because when people attack the behaviour of a narcissist, they feel attacked themselves, and it can often really trigger them when people are talking about horrific things somebody's done, and they will automatically stand up for this person, because what they're really doing is they're standing up for themselves. And so you'll often see really narcissistic people standing up for other narcissists and having no sympathy with the victim. Rosalie Martinez was a defence attorney, and she fell in love with Oscar Ray Bolin, who had murdered and raped women. And she fell in love with him when she met him on death row. And she said that she found that he was just really lonely, and seemed vulnerable, and that was how she felt, and so she related to that, and that was what made her fall in love with him. And she then defended the reason why he did things and said, you know, he didn't really mean to do that. That wasn't him acting from his true self. And she fought for him, you know, she didn't want him to be on death row, and she didn't think it was fair. Carol Ann Boone defended Ted Bundy. You know, she was his girlfriend after he went to jail. You know, she met him and she was convinced that he was innocent, and she defended what he did. And this is something you'll often find, you know, even when people have all the evidence in front of them, they're still convinced the person didn't commit the crime. Some of them think of this person as a sort of ideal partner because they know where they are at all times. So insecure women who maybe have been cheated on in the past can look at this person and know that they know where they are, they know that they're not cheating on them. Some women are attracted to men who are killers because they see them as very masculine, and it's a sort of biological instinct to be attracted to someone that masculine. Many people who defend a murderer are doing so because they're trying to understand the murderer. You know, they have empathy, and they want to see the best in people, and they want to even see the best in a murderer. You know, it's much easier to think that the person went temporarily insane and snapped and did what they did than to accept that this person is the kind of person who just wouldn't have any regrets about doing it. Some of them might have a parenting instinct that they see a lost little boy or girl in the murderer, and they're driven to want to protect them. Narcissists have what are known as flying monkeys, and these are damaged people who will run about doing a narcissist's bidding. So they might stand up for the narcissist to the people who are criticising them. You know, they'll attack people on the behalf of the narcissist. They might spread gossip about people. They'll just do, you know, whatever the narcissist wants, whatever's going to make life easiest for the narcissist. And I'm going to talk about those more in future videos. But others can relate to the murderer, and that scares them, because they can imagine themselves doing something like that. And so if the murderer is, you know, what other people see as a terrible, frightening person, then they have to accept that they are as well, and they don't want to. Narcissists like to provoke people, and if you tell everyone something really shocking that they're going to have a big reaction to, then you're going to be the center of attention. And if people get emotionally affected by what you're talking about, you know, if it's the kind of issue that people are going to get emotional about, then that means as a narcissist you're going to get narcissistic supply. And so in Facebook groups talking about the murders, for instance, you get a lot of trolls who want to shock people by blaming the victim. And they get off on the reaction of people. You know, if people are upset or offended, then that gives them emotional supply, and they feel powerful. They feel like they matter, you know, and they'll just continue to do that. They'll continue to provoke people by talking about how amazing the murderer is and so on. And they'll do it even though they know the facts. They know that this person killed an innocent victim, and they know that, you know, that they're not in any doubt about what happened. They still, regardless of what they think about the crime, they still just yearn this this emotional reaction from other people in the Facebook group. Narcissists have not emotionally developed, so their emotional development is aligned with that of a young child's. And you see this in trolls really quite obviously. Trolls will appear often in Facebook groups, at any sort of online platform, and what they do is they do whatever they can to try to get attention. They want to emotionally affect people who read their comments, and they'll go to great efforts to do this. You know, they'll even go to the trouble of having multiple accounts. So if you think about the hassle of creating an account, they'll fill in, you know, a form each time. They'll just go to that hassle just so that they can write a comment to try to get that narcissistic supply that they're so reliant on. And it's a sign of desperation, you know, to try to get this control. And another thing that they will often do is, even, not always, but often, the profile picture that they use is designed to try to look scary, you know, so that even that has some kind of emotional impact. And you know, but if you think about who you're really dealing with, if there was a profile picture of a 4-year-old, then for the people who can get really affected by this, which is natural, you know, but if they could see that in that profile picture there was just a 4-year-old child, they might look at it a bit differently. If you think about the way a 4-year-old child acts, you know, they might do something naughty and look at their mother's face like, you know, waiting for this reaction. And then sometimes if they don't get it, they do something naughty again, and then if they still don't get it, they might shout "Mom," because they want to be seen doing this naughty thing. And it's a similar thing with a troll. You might ignore the troll the first time, and then the second time they try to say something that might be more disturbing, you know, that might get if that didn't get a reaction, this will. And very much like a 4-year-old. And what's interesting is they can get their narcissistic supply just by using their imagination. So even if they can't see the person that they're trying to get that reaction from, and even if they never hear from them, they can fantasize about how this person might be reacting, and that's enough to give them this narcissistic supply. So the power of the imagination is really important, and if only they could use this imagination they have to you know, change into someone who doesn't need to affect people like this, someone who thinks enough of themselves that they don't need to feel like they matter in this way. You know, they can feel like they matter anyway just for being a human being. I made this video when building works were going on at the place next door, and there were motorboats going up and down the river, so I had to keep stopping recording, and so I was a bit distracted. Now, I don't know if you can hear it, but the birds are going absolutely crazy. It's actually really hard to find places to make videos, you know, where things are quiet. Anyway, I wanted to add in something about Chris Watts in particular and how people view him. And because I was a bit distracted before and I missed talking about it. So what I wanted to say is that people either buy into his mask or they don't. If you don't buy into his mask, then the murders make sense, because he's somebody who doesn't have empathy, he's somebody who only thinks about himself, and so with those two characteristics, it means that he could be capable of doing what he did. But if you do buy into his mask, then nothing makes sense. And then you have to create a story in order for his actions to make sense. So the story that many people created was that Shanann was somebody who was so abusive that she completely changed the character of Chris Watts. Something that isn't possible. Nobody's character can change. You can't suddenly have absolutely no empathy for people and murder small children, you know, especially not your own small children. None of it makes any sense. But a lot of people have created that story, and they've used things like the way Shanann could be bossy to justify this story, you know, that she wasn't just bossy, she was really abusive, that she emasculated him. In reality, she was concerned in the last few days of her life, she was concerned that she had done that. And she was questioning herself because Chris Watts had told her that she'd been controlling, that he couldn't hang a picture without him being there. So she'd been trying to change that about herself. And she was talking to her friends and she was saying she was worried she had been emasculating him. And so somebody who is abusive is not going to question themselves, not going to look into their behaviour in the way that Shanann was. I have talked a bit about the way that Shanann could be bossy in my video called Chris Watts Loving Guy Who, I'm trying to remember what it's called, Chris Watts Loving Guy Who Snapped or Covert Narcissist. So in that video I talk a bit about why she may have been quite bossy, and about how when somebody hands you over the decisions, it does bring out a bossier side in you. And with a covert narcissist, that's very often what happens, you know. They suck up to somebody so much that that person that they're with ends up being the decision maker about everything, because the covert narcissist gives their partner a sort of fake power, and that's the way they suck up to people. That's the sort of false connection they have with people, is to let them feel like they'll do anything for them and that everything revolves around them. And so it's going to be hard for somebody to not act on that a bit, because everyone's human. And I think there would have been a combination between that and the way that Chris Watts was quite childlike, in that he didn't take genuine responsibility for himself. And so it would have felt a bit like having another child, I think, to Shanann. And so that probably would have brought out her bossy side as well. And I'm not saying that she wasn't bossy, because maybe with anyone she may have been a leader a bit, but I do get the impression, certainly from what I've seen, that she was open to looking at herself, to wanting to grow, and to having a lot of empathy for people. And somebody who is abusive doesn't have those characteristics. Then we need to look at why it is that somebody would buy into the mask of Chris Watts after we know the facts, after we know the way that he disposed of the body, that he has admitted to killing them, and, you know, he's talked about how he killed them. Not everyone believes his story about how he killed them, but I think, you know, everyone believes that he disposed of their bodies in the way that he did, and that he lied to the cameras in the way he did. And yet many people still hold on to this idea that his mask is real and that he's a good guy. So, you know, then you're faced with the question of, okay, why do you think he's a good guy? And I think there are different reasons for this. I think one of them is, and I'm risking repeating myself a bit here because I've made a video about it, but I wanted to add this in. I think one of the reasons is because people relate to him and they don't want to see themselves as capable of what he's capable of without it being someone else's fault. Narcissists don't take responsibility for themselves. Everything is somebody else's fault. And so if you relate to him, that would be pretty frightening. And rather than face that fear, it can be a lot easier to blame someone else. And also if you do relate to him to quite an extent, then the likelihood is that you are a narcissist, you know, or certainly very narcissistic. And so that is quite a difficult thing to face. And by the nature of you being like that, you're probably going to be likely to blame someone else for those characteristics you have. And so that's one of the reasons. Another reason is it's very frightening to think that we aren't good judges of character. And it can be reassuring to think that you can judge a character well and that would never happen to you, what happened to Shanann. And so I think a lot of people think that it must be someone else's fault because otherwise they have to face the fear that this could happen to them. So as long as Shanann brought it on herself by her own abusive behaviour, that means that they're safe and it would never happen to them because they're much too nice. And so then they can feel safer and they can feel like they don't have anything to fear. There are people who just really want to see the best in people. And I think to a degree that has happened with Chris Watts. But when it comes to the point where you know, evidence was told to the public, which was very early on, that they found out how the children's bodies were disposed of, it gets to the point where people seeing him as a good guy purely because they see the best in people doesn't quite fit, because it just doesn't make sense. And so I would think that many of those people who just like to see the best in people and have done it to that degree with Chris Watts are doing it because they have been abused and they can't recognise an abusive person when they see one because they've got so used to blaming someone else for their abuse that they've suffered, and they may well have blamed themselves, you know, and so they might well blame Shanann for what happened to her. So I hope that was helpful. If you have questions that you want to ask me about Chris Watts that are sort of relevant to narcissism, then please put them in the comment section, because if I get enough that I can answer, then I'll make a video where I answer those questions. Please subscribe and see you in the next video.